You want me to go first, Thurman?
Oh, please.
So we ask them. I mean, that's the main thing we do.
Simple.
Within the private equity business, the main drivers of firm governance are who's running the firm, who's making management decisions, who's on the investment committee, who's making investment decisions, and how are the economics shared. And it's our duty, obviously, to know that information to make the best investment decisions. There are many different ways to make money in the private equity industry. We have a bias towards investing with firms where the economics are shared more broadly. They're not all in one person. And so to find that out, we have to ask the GP these questions. So it's really in our interest to do that, to see our economics shared broadly. We don't want someone to make, we want the firms to speak truth to each other so they don't just speak to someone who's controlling all the economics. And so we ask them who has that control, who is on the investment committee, and who is getting the economics, who's getting the carry, and who owns the management company. And obviously, if you cross that then with who are the diverse professionals, then you can find something out. And so it's just a very simple part of our due diligence process. We say, okay, who's getting the economics? I will be honest, there are some transactions that are so hard to access. Some of the the best firms out there are trying to answer fewer questions. That's their power in the market. But what we do is we just ask. That's the first step. And over time, our experience has been that leads to then actually more answers. They want to do well on that question.
I would agree. We're certainly looking for independent. So that means firms that are at least 51% owned by the employees who work there. So small, independent firms. We work across the country. So in Illinois, for example, there's a statutory definition of emerging manager that defines that as disabled veteran, minority, and or woman-owned. And so similar to Ed's response, we simply ask, what are you? And more importantly, we're looking for firms that are interested in building and becoming much more sustainable and long-term institutional quality. So the relationship we have with our sub-managers is one it's akin to a partnership. And so the idea of being open, the idea of disclosing information, the idea of being open to our coaching and suggestions is the fundamental basis of the relationship. So if a firm didn't want to disclose that as part of our diligence, that would be a red flag. Because the question is, what are you hiding? But more importantly, on a more affirmative point, one ought to be proud of who works there, and one ought to have a firm owner or a leader of a firm or leaders of a firm ought to have an intentional plan to diversify ownership, ought to have an intentional plan to attract the best talent. And we know that people make better investment decisions when there's cognitive diversity and all kinds of diversity. And so to the extent someone doesn't want to disclose that, again, it's a little bit problematic.
I just want to add one thing, because I think CalSTRS, as other institutional investors, has an extraordinary transformational power to do with what these gentlemen just said, which is ask the question. So I want to give you an example. Our firm filled out an RFP just recently for a public plan in August. And the question that the staff must have told their consultant to ask, I'm going to read it, was, what firm initiatives do you, the manager, have to promote diversity and inclusion in the real estate industry? Just asking that question will require measurement, and that is a huge step forward.
This is something that we actually ask all of our managers across the platform, and I think really focusing on the firm ethos and the culture of the firm and the acknowledgement and the degree of thoughtfulness that they show in answering the questions, and acknowledging sometimes there's a bias and there's something that they need to think about and being mindful. And as Thurman said, the transparency, but also even getting more granular and looking at the workflow assignments of people by metrics that are diverse, right? What are the more junior assignments? What are the more mundane assignments versus higher level assignments and roles on the investment committee? And then how do you look at the accountability for senior people? Like, is there a real mechanism to see if there's something that holds people accountable and rewards them for diversity? And then the transparency in the general conversation. So I think it's really digging deep into the due diligence process with questions that are going much deeper in terms of what people are doing, and then how they're running their own business and externally facing on the topic of diversity themselves as an organization.
So Stephanie, are you able to get that granular on some of these larger firms? Because I think, as Ed was talking about, it's really easy to say, okay, if you're a small firm, how are the economics broken up?
Right.
Who sits on the investment committee? Because like you said at the beginning, you don't want people sort of putting on a good face, hiring a diversity officer, or hiring a bunch of junior level associates that may not actually have any real, shared economics. So, I mean, how do you get to that in a very large firm? And even in some cases, some of these publicly traded, large private equity firms.
Well, I think the publicly traded ones are mandated and required to report certain things. So there's, or self-identification. If we will try to assess for you if you don't kind of make that
That's a big
determination
piece.
yourself. So that in that case, I think it's a little bit easier. But I think this is something that we're doing that's a newer initiative, and I think it is still a challenge, right? But I think asking the questions, having multiple organizations, so having firms like Goldman Sachs start to ask the questions of the managers on their platform will hopefully start to make a difference. With the more firms asking that have influence and the ability to allocate dollars, I think hopefully you'll see a trend shift. But it's, how important it is certainly reflected in the willingness of answering the questions, I think.
I would think that it's not very different qualitatively from the kinds of engagement that you do around corporate governance. In other words, to the extent that you ask questions around board composition, et cetera, it's a similar kind of questioning that you would ask around diversity and equity and inclusion.
Yeah, I would just add as another example, so we score every fund that comes in front of us that we're considering investing in on their ESG characteristics. And that wasn't the norm 10 or 15 years ago, but they're used to us asking about it now. And they know we're going to ask literally. And so then when you're in the advisory committee after we close on a transaction, it's just a normal part of the business. And that changed over time. And there were challenges in how would you define these things, but norms started to exist. And it is not odd now for a GP to come to us in the initial meeting and saying, this is how much we focus on ESG. So I think that's a pretty good model for how you can do this. You begin to ask, you make it a norm, then you track it. I think Chris said it well. You can't manage it unless you measure it. So you've got to start and move that forward.
Debbie, you started at the beginning talking about how it's not by accident that you're a majority-owned women firm and that 55% of your employee base is women or people of color. Are there other initiatives besides just the leadership that you've sort of embedded into the culture at your firm?
Sure. I will, I'll give you one because we say often it's not enough for just Artemis to be diverse. It's not enough for us to partner with other emerging or really diverse firms, but that we have a responsibility to provide capital access to others, but also to build a diverse entry-level pipeline into the industry. Because I often say, look, people aren't born CEOs, right? Talent is evenly distributed, it's just not evenly developed. So if we know that diversity is important to you, then we have a responsibility to help create a more diverse industry. So about 6 years ago, we created a summer enrichment program where we expose a majority, minority, and women undergrads through a partnership with something called SEO, Sponsors for Educational Opportunity, which is on the private equity side as well. And it's a learning intensive summer enrichment program. We've graduated 87 young people, 80% of whom are of color. And in 2017, Chris Ailman challenged me. He said, you're the CEO of a diverse firm, and you're a partner with CalSTRS, and you have a responsibility to change the face of the real estate industry. And so I introduced, seriously, he did say that. It was actually a little more graphic, but I'm going to read now. But in doing so, we introduced our summer enrichment program to an organization called PRIA, which is the Pension Real Estate Association that the head of real estate, Mike DeRay, is on the board. And Mike DeRay and CalSTRS instrumental in terms of the leadership and early support of the first ever real estate track being created for the real estate industry. Success in this program is due in a very large part to the CIOs amongst the LPs, the institutional capital. And this program really has the potential to change the face of the real estate industry.
Aisha, I'm sure you have a question or two more, but what we're going to do is we're going to allow a couple of board members to weigh in at this point, and then if we have additional time, we'll allow you to finish with some of the questions, okay?
The chair of investments right there.
Thank you. Steve?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'm the last person who want to steal Aisha's thunder, so I hopefully won't ask any of the question. I know the first question you wouldn't ask because you would know this answer. What is majority diverse? I've never heard that term before.
Yeah, so I think
before.
I was the one who said that
Yeah.
term. So it's where women or people of color own more than half of the economics in a firm. At least that's that's how I'd paraphrase it. Either the management company or the carried interest. And why I was using that phrase was there are some firms where there are diverse folks, but they don't own a majority of the firm. And so we've seen some more diffusion of diversity in the industry, was what I was trying to say. There are still majority diverse firms. I think Thurman's firm is majority diverse, for example. And so that was the context.
So a majority diverse firm, in at least one person's definition, might not be diverse internally. It could have majority ownership that's diverse and yet not have underlying staff that would be diverse. Is that
Chris,
right?
go ahead.
I know I'm not on the panel. You hit it on the head though, Steve. That is the problem I face when I get approached by the legislature. They define it simply as, is the CEO or the owner of the firm diverse? And they frankly, I have to admit, never ask about any other employee. Their focus is just on one person at the top. And my point is, that doesn't cut it. It's gotta be more comprehensive. But it's not, and that also implies it's a private firm, which eliminates tons of managers.
And I would just add one other thing. When we say that, I didn't note this. It's also that the folks who are diverse make the decisions too. So they're not passive owners. They actually are making these, executive management decisions, investment decisions.
So I think the idea is ownership and control. And so to Ed's point, that's making key decisions as well as having a majority call on the economics of the firm. Our firm happens to be 100% employee owned and 100% of our ownership, 10 partners, of which I'm one. Several are here with me today. My colleagues are people of color. So that's the ownership, and there are 10 of us.
Yeah, and I think, Deborah, you mentioned about different manifestations, about how diversity can hold itself in many different forms. And I guess that's sort of what we're interested in, is it's not just either majority owned, but also the staffing of the firm and how they reach out to others. There's a lot of ways to measure it. That's what
And it's staffing up and down the organization, right?
Yeah. Let me just say, and it's great that you work with CalSTRS. I also have the honor and pleasure of sitting on CalPERS for the treasurer from time to time. And these are to my way of thinking, in California anyway, these are the two institutional funds that people look to for leadership in areas like this. I had the pleasure of serving on a smaller, not so small, LA Fire and Police. They're probably in 25, 30 billion. But nonetheless, we would look toward STRS and PERS to lead the way in telling us how to go about this. Are you finding that to be true in your business, that we're like the bell cows here? We sort of can get attraction and lead the others to do this in a similar fashion. So I'm wondering whether or not you see that happening based on your work with us.
No question, CalPERS and STRS are thought leaders. But there are other thought leaders as well throughout the country, particularly in the state of Illinois. For example, there are large funds there because of the legislation, because of a very active engagement with the state legislature and so active legislative oversight. They are a leader there. So is the state of New York. I would say state of Texas as well. So there are others, but certainly CalPERS as well as CalSTRS are looked to as thought leaders in this space.
And let me just be more specific with the question, though. Is there an opportunity for the experiences that you're having through us to be translated to other smaller institutional funds?
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Thank you.
It's happening.
Sharon?
I had a couple questions, and one is about language, and so just forgive me, because I feel like sometimes when we talk about this stuff, it gets really PC and awkward, and I just feel like it's the end of the day, and I just want to understand how we use language, because we've been talking about kind of a minority-owned company, but in a lot of the conferences I'm at, we talk now about diversity and inclusion, and sometimes the term minority doesn't always include, I mean, it seems like it's more related to race and gender. And it seems like, the conversation now is broader to like sexual orientation and even skill set and your comments earlier, Aisha. And so I was just curious if language is changing in the industry so that we kind of use the same language, so that there's a sort of even for me, I've noticed like with some of our stuff that we use diversity, and I think saying diversity and inclusion to me captures more of the essence of, I think, who we want to be as an institutional investor. I don't mean to be picky about this, but I kind of think language matters in terms of if we're really trying to move the needle in terms of culture. And so I wondered if you guys anybody could just talk about that a little bit. Do you feel like you're using different language now in your organizations, or how do you use language and talking about this issue to provide a culture in your organization that is more inclusive, but also sends a message to the investment world that we really want to capture a more diverse and inclusive population, whether that's our staff or whether that's in the C-suite. I mean, in a perfect world, it's going to be on every level. So can you kind of talk about that, anyone?
Sure.
Deborah?
I mean, I'll take a stab. Look, the most important thing for any diverse manager is access to capital. Because if we have access to capital, then we have the opportunity to perform, right? And each public pension plan, depending upon what state they're in, has different definitions. What we've tried to do is make the definition as broad as possible, and to actually focus on not only diverse ownership, but what is the pathway for other diverse members of a firm to receive ownership, and can that ownership be taken away? And I think, once again, asking the questions of our managers is changing behavior from a diversity definitional standpoint. On inclusivity, that's what I meant when I said intentional inclusivity. You have to have policies. Like diversity here, it's a board level, but the board needs to set the policy as to what is important. And then we should respect that, and in our actions and what we do, it should be, you should be able to measure us, right? Inclusion for let's say our firm is, we won't allow a promotion from an analyst to an associate to a VP, unless that title, that level, that person has worked with everybody that's a level above them. That creates a level of inclusivity, because you can't just default to, well, I'm going to work with this guy, or I know this person. And so it has to be intentional. And I think we're all much more sensitive to what we call kind of unconscious bias. And there's a lot of data actually. Mike has given me articles on either the diversity dividend or even the unconscious bias, where you could have two portfolios. There's a very interesting study, two global equity, same stocks. Only difference is one's portfolio manager is a man and one's a woman. 80% of the time, the portfolio that has the man's name is selected. So you do have to not worry about being PC, and you actually have to look within and make sure that you are setting intentional policies and measurement in order to achieve results.
I would just add that we work with 21 institutional clients across the country, and we work with them in customized, separately managed accounts. And so what that gives us the great opportunity and privilege to be able to work with them and help to advise them, but ultimately those policymakers define what diversity means for them. So in Illinois, it has a certain definition that the legislature has helped to define. And so I would suggest that all the, our precision around language is important, but there's an old saying, a rose by any other name is still as sweet. And so I think the key is, what does diversity and inclusion mean for CalSTRS? And from that, how do you apply that across the board? And your annual diversity reports begin to do that. And so the language can be a bit imprecise at times, but I think, again, the beauty is in the eye of the beholder. And the tone is set at the top. So in this case, it's how you define as the board, as the fiduciaries on behalf of the teacher beneficiaries, how do you define this consistent with your values? And then begin to apply that in a way that you can begin to measure the impact of that and make tweaks as you go. So it's all of the above.
I would say one of our best examples is our own team, like Chris, your leadership of our own staff. I mean, if you look out in the audience and, I think our investment staff, I don't know how we rate among institutional investors, but we have a lot of diversity on our team, which I'm proud that we can model that.
Sure.
Well, and I just wanted to say, Sharon, I think one of the things you're getting at too is, you're right, it's no longer just about race and gender, but encouraging self-identification too, because America is this melting pot of, races and ethnicities and some of the LGBTQ discussions. That has to come, someone has to be willing to self-identify. But I think by starting to ask the question and encouraging folks to, that makes a difference too.
So Aisha and Chris, to policy, I feel like I should know this, but when in the RFP process, how do we, to your question of asking the question, how do we interact with potential partners on, do we ask, what is the percentage of women in your organization, minority ownership, how many are in the C-suite? I mean, can you give us some sense of how we interact with potential partners on diversity and inclusion?
You're not gonna like my answer. My answer is inconsistent.
It depends.
No, inconsistent. Has a lot to do with Prop 209 and what are we allowed to ask and navigating that field. And I think that's why having you define what diversity means and inclusion helps us then figure out how do we ask it. There's a lot of legal safeguards in terms of asking that in the RFP process for us, and that's what we have to navigate. We ask that once managers are on board, and we're looking for that because we're aware and we care, but we just really feel hampered about how to ask about that. And I have told you before, I found from when we started this in '03, the easiest way for us to accomplish this was actually to partner. We've heard me talk about the fund of funds. These are all our fund of funds right here in front of us. Not all of them, but many of them. They have the ability to ask that pointed question. And so it's easier for us to have an extension of us than do that. But these are great. We're getting information and learning too. And that's, I think, part of that power is understanding, as I already took away, that commitment to diversity and inclusion, that if we could define how to measure that at a firm, that might be very powerful.
And I think measuring it, but then what's the materiality of that? So how much do you place a value, what's the percentage score that you weigh to diversity versus, profitability or other metrics? And so that the onus also has to be on the organizations asking these questions to put meaningful weight on that in the way that they do other metrics.
Good point.
Joy?
Thank you. Thank you very much for coming to join our panel today. So I have the privilege of serving on my company's Diversity and Inclusion Leadership Council, and we actually spend a lot more time talking about inclusion than diversity because we do a great job, I think, bringing a diverse workforce in the doors, but keeping them, engaging them, and seeing them move up in the organization is much more difficult. So I know, Ed, you mentioned that we've seen some success in the emerging managers that we've had that have become sort of core managers in our private equity program. But I think in some of the other programs that we've had over the years, there's an opportunity to see if we can improve on that and see more of those emerging managers be successful. So I guess I just wonder what observations you have, either about us or about some of the other funds that you work with, about things that we can do. Once we get these managers in, are there things that we can do or should consider to, help them be successful? Because ultimately that's our goal.
I think and we've had these discussions with CalSTRS, but one of the observations that we've seen with some of the other other clients, particularly, I'll just use one example, New York State Common Retirement Fund. They have probably been a leader within the industry in terms of what we call, for lack of a better term, kind of graduating, if you will, or transitioning managers to direct hire, and being able to circumvent the traditional RFP process to be able to do that. That has been an issue with CalSTRS, but I think the point you made about external managers, and Deborah made it earlier, managers are looking for access to capital to grow. That's the metric by which they determine success. And so in growing, they're able to hire more people, they're able to develop additional investment strategies, they're able to become sustainable, long-term participants in the industry. But so a pathway to becoming mainstream would be another policy objective that I would offer for this CalSTRS board to consider. What's the policy pathway that allows, and it may require some interaction with the state's procurement process. It could require some changes to that process. But as someone who used to work in the legislature years ago, laws are made to be changed. And so to the extent that there needs to be change, then that would be a positive change.
Sorry, Thurman. I might just add, I mean, I think, so it's a hard problem because in the private equity industry, incumbents are often incumbents.
Excuse me one second. That's for public market managers. Okay. And so we've had probably 30 of those graduate across our platform over the years, but New York State Common has probably been the leader among those 30 in finding that pathway to direct hire.
Right. So in private equity, there's a view often that first quartile performance persists. That's actually one of the ideas in the business. You want to invest in the first quartile funds because that's going to persist. You know, that's changed a lot. If you look hard at that, that's not as true as it used to be. And so I think actually I know this, the CalSTRS private equity team looks hard at, well, when do we get off the bus? When do you stop investing with someone if their performance no longer persists? That's a really hard decision to make. And there's not much reward for it either, because it takes so long in this industry to tell if something is working. So but that is what makes space for new managers. Rotation out of incumbents who are not performing is actually what makes the space for new managers. And then rewarding folks who bring you new managers and making the space that way, because your staff has found some very good new managers. And that's to be rewarded, because that's, the diverse managers, they usually start out as small managers. It's very difficult to invest in a really small manager given your size. That's why you work with people like us. But creating a way forward, that's really what Thurman is saying, a place for that. And having the transparency on the core portfolio to say, well, if someone's not succeeding, we shouldn't keep going with them, because actually they're taking up a spot. And that's what's going on. And it's hard to make that decision to stop, but that's, your staff is very incented to make the most money they can for the board, right, for the beneficiaries. So, but that's one of the toughest issues. So I would say being open-minded when they bring you the new one. That's actually a change. Okay.
We're going to, I don't see anyone else in the queue. There's a few things that we need to take care of here. First of all, I want to thank Edward, Stephanie, Thurman, and Deborah for being here with us today and sharing your thoughts and experiences and insight on a very important topic to this board and to this organization. So much of what you said I wholeheartedly agree with. Being aware of one's own unconscious bias, to be awake. To be awake to one's own unconscious bias. Secondly, to look within at our own policies, a pathway to access to capital. The NFL at one point had no African American, well, a few quarterbacks too, but no coaches, head coaches, African American. CIO and I have had some side conversations about maybe a policy that we bring forth to this committee at the appropriate time, but that has changed. There are now black men coaching in the NFL because someone had an idea to say, we need a policy that ensures that people have an access to compete for the jobs. We can't guarantee you the job, but we're not going to close the door to you any longer because of the color of your skin. And I'm saying I'm not equating, but maybe we need to look at a policy that makes sure that we ensure that by policy access, and then we can hold ourselves accountable. How many people did we actually interview for those? The transformational power of CalSTRS. Wow. To be in a position in life where you have transformational power, I couldn't agree with you more. It would be a huge, huge mistake to be in a position where you have transformational power and you don't use it for good. And how can we do that, use that for good? I think you gave us some suggestions of the work that you're doing in your firm, and I know that we're doing at CalSTRS, but we can do more of it so that more young people of color, women, my daughters, and other young girls in schools and all across this country don't feel discouraged or don't believe they can compete for jobs in finance. I know firsthand that we've done a lot. I've sat in meetings where people of color have said to me what Mr. Ailman has done at schools in South Central Los Angeles, at Crenshaw High School every year. A lot of us don't know that. But we can do more. We should challenge ourselves to do more and to partner with. And I challenge you, and I challenge everyone in the industry, those who have great influence, either by their positions or by their wealth, to partner to create those pathways for young people to pursue careers in finance. And that starts really, really young. Because as you said, you know, essentially you said we're all born basically equal, and talent isn't equally developed. As a teacher, I know that very, very well. So I think the panel discussion was great. We have a reception that has began a few minutes ago, but before we adjourn, we are going to, I want to thank our superintendent of instruction, who has been a public servant in the seat of superintendent of instruction for the last 8 years. Has served the children, I think it's 6 million children in California's public schools, and hundreds of thousands of teachers and educators and classified employees. A tremendous public servant. Tom, thank you for that work. And thank you for giving us Michelle Zumont for the last 8 years. She's been such a dedicated and responsible trustee, and it's been a great honor to work alongside her. I also want to recognize our treasurer, who's not in the room right now, Treasurer Chung, who's in his last meeting as a member of the investment committee. It's been a true honor and a great privilege to work alongside John Chung and to actually call him a friend. He has been a great asset to our fund. I want to thank John. And of course, some of his designees, Steve Juarez, for his dedication and contribution to this committee. You've been terrific, Steve. It's been great to work alongside you. I'll miss you. I hope we stay in touch. And Frank Moore, wherever he is. Frank, thank you for your service as well and your dedication and preparation for each and every meeting and your service to this committee and in an extension to the teachers and members of our system. With that, we have, yes, Superintendent.
Just to say thank you for the recognition, but most importantly to have us all thank Michelle Zumont. She has been a superstar, a champion. She keeps me informed of the meetings and some of the controversies and the heavy debate and the passion. So if Michelle could just stand up and be thanked one more time. Where's Michelle? She was here.
She's in the back having M&Ms probably.
And there you go. Well, thank you for having the chance to recognize her.
Thank you. Yay. So with that, we have a reception in the cafe. Thank you. The meeting is adjourned.